Hi there, it's Jack Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. I'm back. Thank you for being patient. I've been off for about 5-6 months now, just while I got married and bought a house and moved down to Bournemouth again, but things are settling, so it's time to bring the podcast back. And my first guest for this return is Bjarni Gunnarsson, who's an Icelandic sound artist based in the Netherlands. And his recent album, Lure, is one that I've been trying to penetrate over the course of the last few weeks. It's a work of such immense detail that the first couple of listens turn out being very bewildering indeed. But there's always a sense of causation and relationship with the sounds that I think conjures a sense of significance that keeps me coming back. It's like there's a language being laid out, or something being communicated, or a drama that's playing out through sound, despite the fact that there's too much of it to ingest too quickly. And it's a wonderful record. I still feel like I'm mining into the ground, and I've no idea how much further I have to go before I have that moment of epiphany where I feel like that me and the record are in alignment. But that process is compelling in itself, to just get to know this record. So you can find more information about Bjarni at bjarni-gunnarsson.net, and he picked some great albums. One of them I was kind of familiar with, but the other 2 were completely new on me. And I really hope you enjoy this episode. I had a great time talking to him. Without further ado, Bjarni Gunnarsson on Crucial Listening. So you've brought 3 important albums to the table today. In addition, you've also recently released a new record of your own, which I've spent the past few weeks trying my utmost to get my head around. As I speak to you now, I say I'm still absolutely nowhere near. But that for me makes it quite pertinent, I think, to ask you how long you spent working on it. I mean, it's a record that I think that involves a certain labour in terms of listening to it, so I can only imagine what it would have been like to actually put the record together. So how long have you been working on Lure?
Yes, so I worked on it for a little bit more than a year. It took some time also to the whole release process, so it's actually about a year old now, now that it's out.
Right.
So I worked about it for a year. Yeah, it's always tricky to compare, or interesting to compare the time I went to making a record to the listening process. For this one, it was really about making the first piece that's Prism, starting the record. That took the majority of the time, and once I had that, and once I had created sort of the software and things like this I was using for that, and the other ones came much more naturally, which is not the first time something like this happens. So once you get to a certain place, things tend to fall into shape, but getting there is perhaps the creative bit and interesting bit. Yes.
So you mentioned the software processes that lay at the foundation of the first track, and then I guess by extension the record as a whole. And these are the generative processes that are referenced, I guess, in the accompanying material, the text that comes along with the record. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I completely useless when it comes to understanding, I guess, the more technological side of sound and these generative processes that often go into music. So what kind of inputs are you using in order to basically, how are you feeding these processes and what are they actually doing to the sound?
Yeah, well, that's a Big question, good question. So I guess this extends a little bit. So my previous practice, which is just to look at sound as a little bit of like a process, or a little bit of something that is constantly coming into existence. So not as simply a list of notes or list of certain sounds or so, but more textural and more kind of inward and more looking and so on. So how are these processes done? I set up these small programs. Actually, for this one, more than the previous one, it was sort of a simplification. So there's a lot more pitches on this album. There's a lot more simple rhythms and so on. But I guess an important part is simply how they are set up, a small little processes that I allow to run, and then I'm thinking about how to interact with them. So I could compose with them, so put them into shapes and put them into time and record them a bit, but also leave them and make them kind of unfold to some sort of an inner logic. So it's this interesting relationship between me while I'm kind to figure out the processes and the process that I tend to enjoy letting it run on its own as well.
When you talk about this music as a process of becoming, I think the first thing that I wonder at that point is, how on earth do you say that this material is done? How does each individual piece end, and how do you reach a point where you're like, okay, this album as a documentation of that process of becoming has a hard end, and I'm now gonna put this out into the world?
That's probably something. It's kind of a different thing actually than what I was describing before. So indeed, it's a good question, and I think we could imagine like even all creative activity to be like something that's continuous. We are. Many of us who are making music, you're always trying to create and produce, and that takes the lifespan of months or years or so on. But every now and then you would like to say stop and present something like an album or so on. And so it's more that like you have this one continuous process, and then you kind of chop out from it, which is similar to the way actually the music is made. And I would say actually you could even hear it in the music itself that it deals a lot with stopping and starting processes and so on. So how you get to a specific end is, I think it's unique to each piece, but it's not something that I think is actually always something it comes rather naturally once the other elements are in place, I say. And I think, like I said, getting to completing the first piece was like a jump, but when you have that jump, I think I can I made the other ones rather straightforward, So some people think it's important to reinvent yourself with each piece you make, and so on. I think it's more. I think it's fine, for example, to do several pieces around similar ideas, or once you reach a certain state, so they are a little bit a different viewpoint on the thing you're working with at that moment. And that, I think, follows all my albums, is that there is something on the album that is specific, and the pieces are just different ways to inspect that behavior, let's say.
Yeah, well, as a listener, I can say I'm grateful that you've done that, because it is incredibly dense music, but in a way that I'm always compelled to listen again and again in order to understand it more. But to have something that has the sense that there is at least a line of continuity running through those pieces, I think is something that I can hang my hat on as I'm listening and establish I guess this is probably the wrong word, but establish a rapport with that one element which stays consistent, which almost acts like an anchoring point to then appreciate the rest of the album elsewhere. Also as well, I mean, one thing that's really struck me as I'm listening, and this is the thing that I think quite interestingly with this record, is rather than coming away and when I look back to my experiences of listening, having memories of particular sounds, it's the transitions and the movements between states on your album that stays with me more than anything. And it feels like something that, I don't know, there's a real sense of causation and very almost like organic movement within your music. And I wondered, is transition something that you spend a lot of time working on when you're putting these pieces together, like the process by which something becomes something else?
Actually, yes, and I'm happy you have sort of encountered this, because I think it's a very important thing. And the way I work is that I often reach states of where I have this kind of sound behavior, and and then I have another sound behavior, and then the task becomes very much how can I get from one to the other? So how can I transition from one to the other? And that becomes kind of the creative problem to solve once you kind of start to address. Once you have many processes that you can use for a certain piece. So actually, I had to think a lot about it, and I think it's something also. I think in electronic music is not always what you hear. There's the cliche that we have two kinds of endings. So either you plug the cable or you fade out, and you could say that in many cases people revert to these kind of things when they are doing transitions. So they have spend a lot of time finding the different points, but perhaps less thinking about how to get from one to the other. Or at least I think this is something that's still very interesting to think of.
Also, as well, I think what comes hand in hand with those transitions is, I think, the sense of force within your music. Like, often those transitions come for me as an accompaniment to a feeling of being pulled or being pushed or being punched. There's a real tactility to your music, which I think is striking when you consider the fact that the process clearly seems quite technical and meticulous. Has it been a priority for you, or is it something that you contemplate to retain a physicality to your music?
Yeah, I think there's two elements to that, which is on the one hand sort of the causality within the music, which I think, even though many composers I value dearly believe that this is maybe perhaps not so important anymore, and the causality is something we might attribute to tonal music and so on. I do think that the way we listen is somehow causally related, and in my music I think it's more something I try to violate or escape from or deal with in creative ways, but I'm always aware of the fact that we are driven by some sort of a stream or a force that kind of unites the music, and I very much want to, even in cases where the music is discontinuous, to kind of connect to that force. Then the other element, which is perhaps related to energy, I think, which is a very vague term. People talk about energy. What does that mean? But I think there's the sound processes I try to arrive at have some sort of energetic phenomenon. So maybe relating also to some of the albums I chose for today is, I think this is somehow very, as a listener, is something we hook on to on a very primal way, and I think to hook onto this in a very primal way is something I also would like to happen for my music, and so it's something I think about, like how does the energy of the piece kind of connect you or drag you into it or make you stay there.
Absolutely. Well, it's certainly doing that, and I have to say I was a little bit nervous about speaking to you today and feeling as though I hadn't really done my homework, because I felt I still hadn't wrapped my head around this record, but I think that's just an inevitability, and something that when I've read other reviews of this album, I certainly don't feel like I'm alone. So I'm looking forward to continuing my journey into the record and trying to acquaint myself with it more and more. Let's move to your albums now, which you've brought 3 important albums here. And one question I like to ask my guests is the way in which you consider the term important, because obviously there's so many different ways that you can approach that, and that you can probably pick 3 different albums for every possible interpretation of that term. But how did you consider the term important, and what classified as important for the purposes of putting this list of albums together?
Yeah, to be honest, I did it in a very intuitive way. So they're, I would say, more or less spaced equally, like 10 years or so between the point they influenced me. So I think they were very much related to a point in time. I picked them as something that influenced me at a point in time, and that I have kind of observed that they stay with me for some reason. So I think the point in time and how they stayed with me was influencing here my choice, yeah. But it was very intuitively, so just when he told me about 3 albums, within a minute or so I thought of these 3, and maybe that's sometimes just the best way of doing things.
Yes. I think otherwise it can quite easily be several days. You can choose whichever album you want to speak about first, Bjarni. I'll let you pick. But if you'd like to tell me the name of the first album and the artist, and also a little bit about why it's important to you as well.
All right. So I think the temporal order makes the most sense. So the first one I chose was Si Fil Shakur from the UK, which is from 1995. It was released. And why did I choose this one? Well, so I was 15 at the time. I remember when this was being released, and it's just some of the soundtracks from a certain part of your youth that stay. Yeah. So I guess what's very special about this album, I think, is there's some sort of a sound element to it. So I was trying to. What do I mean by that? There's a kind of sonic signature in the tracks. The music is very simple. It's minimal, it's kind of general, it has all kinds of properties that I would not be so interested in perhaps today, but it has something of a kind of a uniqueness and a touch to it, and especially in terms of the ambience it gives. It's also, so it's obviously related to this music coming from UK at the moment, like Aphex Twin and Oddtaker and these things, so which I was also listening to as a teenager, but the reason I thought this one, and I think the reason it was special for me also at that time, was it doesn't have this kind of strong connections to dance music or so on. So it's trying to arrive more at the pure sound through other means, which I think was resonating a little bit with me at that moment as well, even though the other artists I just mentioned were some I loved very much. This was kind of a more of a unique take, some kind of a singular presence, if I may say so.
Do you remember how you came into this record? Like how you came across it? Was it through just through following the Warp family of artists at that time?
Yeah, I suppose so. I was thinking about this, and I was introduced to it by a friend.
Right.
And a good friend of mine that was more into this then, and I remember he had it on vinyl, and I still remember this great cover and just the whole kind of experience of putting this record on and feeling that it was somehow a little bit different than the others.
Yeah, I mean, it's a band actually that only really caught my focus recently. I'm 10 years younger than yourself, Bjarni, so I wasn't really cognizant of them at the time that they were, at their most prominent. But having done some research into post-rock, I came across this band and this record. But actually, in fact, I mean, the record that I came across first, and I think this is probably the case for most people, is Queek, or however you pronounce it. I mean, did you, after you discovered this record, did you check out any of their other albums, and did anything else of theirs resonate with you as well?
Not as much.
Right.
I know they're still, or not still, at least recently they were doing some things, and I did check it, and it didn't sparkle the interest this album did. One of the main producers of this was Mark Clifford, and he had other projects that was called Disjecta.
Right.
And I was actually hesitating between that, because that was another one that I was very interested and into at that time. But the other ones that are perhaps more post-rock related, I feel the Seafield ones, they don't have this kind of timeless sound that we find on Shakur. That's a bit kind of removed from everything else, and that's one of the reasons I like it so much. So I think for the Seafield stuff, it was mainly this one, actually.
So is there a track that in particular that feels particularly prominent in your mind when you think of this record?
Just the first one.
Right.
And because the way it starts is somehow so strong, and well, it is kind of a sort of an ambient piece, but it has this kind of energy we discussed in its own very particular way. Yeah.
And is it a record you still listen to now?
Not so much. I listened to it a little bit last week in preparing for this, and I think it has more effects of reminding me of that period or so on, and rather than me finding something new in it now or so. But I still think it's a very dear one to me.
Yeah. It is interesting. I mean, I don't know whether you have many records like this, but obviously there are those albums that outstay their welcome almost in terms of their listening rotation, because they have these threads leading back to like a former self. I've got several albums which, if I heard now, would probably give a couple of listens at most and then move on. But because they have this ability to tap into, a sort of past self, then they gain extra weight. I mean, are there many other records like this Seafeel album that feel that they're still, within your memory and that are still listened to, despite the fact that, they perhaps wouldn't hold so much importance to you had you heard them for the first time now?
Yeah, definitely. I also think I listen a little bit less, but I think more intensively these days. So at some moment, I've always thought very important, because I'm always involved with, I teach electronic music and so on, and I really hate it when people don't listen, because it's such a obvious, I think, part of the whole experience, instead of simply being focused on your own thing. So I really enjoy listening to other people's music, but less now than before. I feel the urge to constantly listen to it. So even if I would listen to the Seafeel album just once every 5 years, that would probably be just fine enough. It would not mean that it has any less importance or interest. It's not a repeated listening that necessarily gives any weight.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very much that stands in opposition to the current zeitgeist, I guess, around listening and the value that has been attributed to listening as of late, in terms of, due to the prevalence of streaming services and the like. I mean, as someone who teaches, have you noticed a changing relationship overall with listening, like within, I don't know, your students or within the people around you?
Yeah, that's a big question. Yeah, there probably is. But it's not a simple. I think it depends also on the individual. I mean, of course, there's this factor of, you sometimes feel people give less of a time to something than they should, and people should listen to something before judging it and so on. But I don't know if it has necessarily increased. So that's not simple. But what you did say is that I do feel that people value, highly something they listen to more frequently. And I don't think, even if you think about music, your own preferred music from the past, it doesn't have to be the music you listen to the most. It's. I think it's more about how it actually stays with you and affects you once you really engage with it, rather than how often you did.
All right, well, let's go to your second album. And I guess if we're doing this temporally, I know what's coming up. But yeah, if you'd like to tell me the name of the record and then also a little bit about why it's important too.
Yes, so the second album I chose is by two composers, so Anna Maria Avram and Janko Dumitrescu, and it's called Soleil Explosion. So why did I pick this album? So it's probably not their most famous work of these two, but it's the first one I had, the first one I got. So I listened to it quite repeatedly, because once I encountered this album and their music, and I actually saw them in concert, I was completely mind blown by this. There was something that fundamentally connected with me and their approach to, especially their approach to sound. So the album has 5 pieces. So there is 2 by Avram and 3 by Dumitrescu. And so they have different setups. So there's a piece for orchestra, and there's computer pieces, and there's 2 pieces featuring viola, one with computer, the other one not. But in all of them and of course there's 2 different composers, but in all of them there's this kind of clear focus on sound itself. So the sound is very alive. The sound is it's changing a lot. So they called it spectral music, but the Romanian spectral music. So it was a little bit different from the French spectral music. But there's a huge kind of emphasis on the kind of micro details of the sound, not only in the frequencies, as the spectral term might be, but just in the evaluation of it. So it really feels alive. It really feels that each kind of gesture has its own little universe. And I think that's something that struck with me very much then, because not at all in modern music, contemporary music, this is always the case, where a lot of it has been maybe going in the opposite direction to avoid any such things. But that struck with me a lot, and I really enjoyed, for example, in the solo computer pieces by Dumitrescu on the CD, he uses very simple techniques, such as just time stretching a sound, which almost now would sound like a cliche to make this whole 2 pieces only with this one method of time stretching a sound. But it's done in a way that he gives such a life and such a detail to the sound, and it's really amazing. So I think it's kind of an extraordinary CD, as are many of them. There are many of these that are kind of similar. This is just the first one that I got encountered with, and I think it still sits with me a lot. I was actually living at the pub in Paris at the time I met this, and I was studying there in what was called CC Mix, and they were frequent visitors there. So they were playing a lot in Paris, and they brought the whole group from Romania in a little van, and they came to play in Paris, and there was always great energy around them, and they were so sort of enthusiastic about the sound itself, which was hard not to be inspired by at that time. And perhaps beyond that CD, it was also the first time I saw a concert with them in Paris. Was something really struck with me with this music and this kind of focus on this attitude to sound. Yeah.
And do you have strong memories of that first concert you saw of theirs? What pieces were they presenting at that concert? And what kind of instruments were they using there?
Well, they brought the ensemble. So if I remember correctly, it was pieces for ensemble. So they have their own Hyperion ensemble. It was called. It was just musicians from Romania, which they had the luxury, of course, to work with constantly, which is not always the case when you have works performed for ensemble and rehearsal time is limited and so on. So these are musicians they knew very, very well. So Aurum and Dumitrescu were conducting themselves as they do as they did ever since, or always do, and that was also quite spectacular.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen these.
Yeah, amazing.
And of course always the focus also on the computer in a very special way. I think the way they used computer sound, so it was very natural and very much as an extension of just the sound, not something different to it. And I think also on this CD it's very natural how a piece can be a solo piece for computer or a piece for computer and viola, and it feels like completely just something that's part of the same idea.
Yeah, it's interesting you draw attention to that, because I guess that's also something which perhaps isn't always a given when those elements are combined. There can, often be the sense that you have the computer and then the viola and then a very sort of overt attempt to bring those into alignment. I'm interested actually to know, so you would have been, 23 at the time that this album came out. Were you making music at this point?
Yeah, so I encountered this album a little bit later. So
right, okay.
I'm about 25. Yes, I was making music. I was thinking about it yesterday. Perhaps on my first album, I could actually sense some of their influences. maybe also relating to what we were discussing previously about energy and so on, and this focus on the sound itself. But I was making music, and this resonated with me in very important ways of my own music as well. I guess to think of sound itself like having its own kind of universe in life is something that's important to me, and something that's also very different from C-field that we discussed in the beginning, where in the end the music is much more minimal, it's much more generic, it's much more detached actually than here, where every sound has you are exposed to every sound in its incredible details, and that's really what the music is about. So we zoom into it in sort of different ways, which is something I think related to the CD or not I'm also interested to do in my own practice.
I mean, that's something that I noticed this morning. So obviously I've been listening to your record, but also as well I put on the Dumitrescu record that was released in like 2013. I think it came out on Ideologic Organ, and it was first thing in the morning. I was in my kitchen and I just felt so awake immediately, and I think it's because it's engaging and firing up a listening faculty which absolutely needs to be alert in order to ingest the material it's hearing. And that's something that I'm definitely getting from your record as well. It's just the sense that there needs to be a real active participation within the listening in order to actually engage with everything that you're hearing. And I'm curious actually, because it's certainly something that I hear within the record that you've picked here, but also your own. Is the sense of, and I mean this in the best way, the sense of labour that's required on behalf of the listener, is that something that you're conscious of as you're putting this record together? Say the role that the listener has to play within your soundscapes?
No, not for me. To be honest, I don't really think about the listener as much as that sounds like I'm avoiding something, but I try to focus on the sound itself and that it merits some sort of a life and development and how to put it into, or stop it or cut it or violate it or make it become predictable or less predictable, and I focus on this. And we've been talking a lot about listening, of course. We're talking about music. I present it, but it's hard. Also, when you were talking about this, how I feel about how people listen today, it's difficult to say this. I think listening is something very personal, so it's hard to compose, I think, with that in mind, especially for other people, or try to assume something on a part of listener. I find that not necessarily the most creative way to approach music from my point of view.
I mean, let's move to your final record now. If you could tell me the name of it and a little bit about why it's important to you as well.
Yes, so the third one is Helena Goff, Microclimata, from 2010. So the second one, actually, I noticed now, speaking to you, the second one from the UK. This is also maybe 10 years after I discovered Dumitrescu, I discovered this one. I think on the surface, it for some people, it sounds a little bit like extended English electroacoustic music, but there's just so much craft in this record. It's an incredible record. Few composers I've ever heard who can really deal with sort of the electroacoustic music medium in such fine ways as she does on this album. She did other albums, but this is really the one I think that is totally incredible. So the music basically has on this album, all the music basically has two very strong states, which is the sort of change, which is very highly articulated gestures that sound only at first glance, I think, kind of impressive. Like some of the traps, I think sometimes electroacoustic music falls in to be impressive. But I think it's once you get above that, you can see the structural importance these have, and how actually she ties it in with the whole flow of the music, which is incredibly well done. So that's the one element, which is the sort of the change, the gesture that, like, for example, the start of the album. And the other one is the static moments that occur between. So all of the pieces, I think, more or less only deal with these two states, and she goes between them, and each gesture brings you back to a sort of static state. The static states are full of details of full of pulsation, for example, but not much of progression is going on. But each time she does it, she kind of switches the angle. So sometimes I imagine a camera that's just looking at an object, and with each kind of gesture you get a new view on what she is observing. So she shifts you into a new view, and this is just so original, the way this is done and the way she treats the sound, and the way she kind of builds up the narrative only from this, that I was very touched by it on immediate listen. I knew that her previous album before, so I always wanted to check it out. I didn't check it immediately when it came out, but just a little bit after. And frankly, I had never heard anything like it. So I think that's how I would start by describing this one.
And this is the first time I heard this album. And in fact, I'd never heard Helena's music before, but I couldn't really believe that once I heard this album, because it felt like something that should absolutely be on my radar. The sense of scrutiny and examination, I think, that she's applying to sound is so infectious as I'm listening to it, and sort of stimulates very much the same state of mind within myself, I think, as I can only imagine that she's employing when she created this record. Have you seen her perform live at all?
No, I have not. I think she actually. I think she stopped making music.
Oh, really?
But yes.
Oh, yeah.
So she was related to this Birmingham school, and I know they were trying to make her come and give a concert last year or so. But I think she moved to Portugal or something, and is just doing something different.
Wow.
Let's hope she will do something again. But no, I never saw her live. I met her once, but I never saw her play live. There are some recordings of it, but I think to me this is still tape music in a sense that what I appreciate so much about it is how it's all so crafted. Not only crafted, but the kind of internal logic. So I find it also with many people, especially if you are trying to build up your own vocabulary, your own causality, let's say, of things, and you try to make music that does not rely on the classic carriers of harmony or rhythm or so on. So how can you make music that develops based on its own criteria? And I think this album is an example of something that's very unique to herself, to her style, and you cannot really think about anybody who did it in such a way, and it's so continuously applied that you just get hooked on the first sound, and then it kind of leads you through the whole album in what seems to be the logic that's, I think, internal to the sound itself, but not something that she kind of imposes, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it feels, to me, I think what's so incredible about this record is, I mean, as you say, it's certainly a sound that feels unique to her, but almost as though you're listening to perhaps a language that you're not fluent in or you don't speak. There's a sense of continuity to what you're hearing, even though if you can't comprehend it, there's still a sense that one thing is following the other in a way that feels very deliberate and very connected. I think the ability to craft that whilst using building blocks which ultimately feel detached from me and different from me, and yet still feel like I can hear something unfolding and still feel something meaningful within it, I think that's such a fundamental thing, and something I can only imagine is very difficult to sculpt in this way. It certainly seems like an album that has, a lot of detail within it.
Yeah, and a remarkable also sense of maturity of how she deals with the sound. It doesn't feel like the work of a young composer, so to speak. It feels like she must have really built up to get to this stage, which I'm happy with. Also about the static passages, I find a lot, because we know from electroacoustic music people using gestures that are kind of strong like this and lead you somewhere, but I tend to I would advise people, if they would like to check out this music, to focus also on the static passages that are happening in between and how they kind of absorb you, even though they're very quiet. And there are, for example, the pulsations. There's a lot of rhythm you can find by just spending a little bit more time with it than just staying on the surface. Right. So there's something very strong also with background, foreground here.
Also, as well, it seems, I didn't realise actually in the first couple of times I listened to it, but she's using a basis of like field recording and also, I think, improvisations for trumpet and bass.
Yeah, so Peter Evans was the famous trumpet player, is supposedly to be found somewhere in the sound world, and I remember I met him once and I asked him about this, and he didn't recognize himself very much actually after having gone.
Wow, yeah.
Gone through these processes of, and I think she also mentioned that there's a lot of recordings of sort of refrigerators and so pulsating devices, but ultimately it seems to me that whatever the sound source is on this album, it is made probably with her processes coming after, so personal that perhaps it's less important than
yes
than what she does later.
Yeah. And what I like actually is the photograph that she has in accompaniment to the like press material that came out for the record, and on the release page is just the grass sprouting out from snow. I don't know if you've seen that, but it feels like almost, you know, I think the caption is something like, "This is something I observed during a particularly intense studio session." And I love that was the sort of a visual emblem that she chose to depict, which was almost like a tiny break, a tiny sprout between these intense, very introverted and what I can only imagine are quite isolated sessions. And the one kind of piece of the physical world that makes it on there is that sort of flash of the outside that she got between being holed up for so long, you know. Well, it made me wonder what your kind of sessions look like. I mean, when you think back to working on your record, what does that look like to you? I mean, is there a particular location that you use for creating your music? Is it happen at a particular time of day? You know, are there any particular rituals that you employ around the composition of your music?
To be honest, it's actually perhaps the opposite, in the sense that it's more like when it starts going, or when I start working on it, wherever it is, it takes over, you know.
Wow.
So be it I have a studio at home, and I also where I teach, I have studios there. So it's not very much related to the space or the time of day or the time of year or so on. I think it's more get in contact with materials, and maybe, as I was saying before when we were talking about listening, that I think they have larger time span. So I think my music is something that just keeps on, and I think there's an obvious kind of development from the first record and to the new ones, and I think it's all part of the same thing. It's part of the kind of inner life of this thing I'm trying to create, whatever that is, which perhaps not easy to put in words, but best experienced by listening to the music itself.
Yeah. In fact, speaking of listening to it, do you have Listening to these records that you picked made me consider how perhaps you're experiencing them. I mean, do you have a particular setup or a place or a situation you use to listen intently, like a stereo system somewhere, or particularly beloved pair of headphones, or how do you listen to an album if you really want to dive into it?
Good question. I don't think I have it like this. I do prefer speakers. So and actually I do prefer kind of a larger space if possible. In the sense, I think music for me is the most interesting in space, not in headphones.
Right.
Some people have a connection with headphones or something more intimate. I think I find much stronger connections with music when I hear it resonate in space. So that could be some of the studios or my living room. That's not the most important, but I do tend to enjoy more larger spaces, I think.
Nice.
Drier spaces, but larger spaces.
Great. Well, I have to say I've spent most of my time listening to your music on headphones. I mean, I was going to ask actually, but considering that I recall you mentioning about the fact that you don't pay too much consideration to the listener experience as you're creating it, rather you focus on the craft. But have you had a chance to listen to Lure in many different spaces and in many different contexts?
Not perhaps as much as I would like.
Right.
Now that you're asking, yeah. No, but I think that's also part of it when you make a record, is that you would like it to be in occurring in all kinds of different contexts and spaces, but perhaps as the creator you also need to then leave it to do that on your own. So I have a few places I worked on it and have listened to it since, but then I guess I sort of leave it, and maybe sometimes you come back to it a little later. What happened with Lure is so it's a vinyl release, and it has algorithmically generated covers, and which are great.
Yeah, beautiful.
Great work. Yes, and all of this took quite a lot of time and effort to do. So there was a sort of a longer gap than usual between the moment I finished the music and the moment the record was released. So to me it feels I'm a little bit far away from it now, even though it's just been released. It's funny to say so, but I was listening to it also this week again, and it's funny how it's already something different.
Well, I look forward to it continuing to be something different. So that's certainly the experience from this side as well. Bjarni, thank you so much for speaking to me today. It's been great to dig into both your record and also the 3 records that you've picked.
Thank you so much for having me in this moment.
And if people want to find out more about yourself and your music, where's the best place for them to be headed online?
Just on my website, Bjarni-Gunnarsson.net would be a good place to start.
Great. Well, thank you once again, and to everyone listening, I'll see you next time.